I am Michelle, and I'm very excited to be here with you all today. This topic is so important, as I think some of you started to highlight when I was had to exit. But we are dealing with so much in our communities right now, and so vicarious trauma and burnout is our topic for the evening, and we'll discussing different techniques and ways to help support ourselves and help support our clients that we work with. And so I am the founder and director of Together Well, a 501c3 nonprofit that connects mental health professionals to the community to provide emotional wellness workshops. And so what that looks like is like a principal or um, a CEO of a company can come to Together Well to our platform, type in a search term, and look up somebody to give a workshop for their community. And so all of the people on our platform have at least a mental health degree, a master's in a mental health field. And so um, it's really supposed to be a community that helps support therapists while helping to support the community. We're also 100% volunteer run and led, and we have over 100 volunteers, including students at universities and that help work behind the scenes to help support our mental health professionals that help support our community. So I created Together Well because I noticed that there was a huge need in our communities. Mental health services are so expensive, and I also noticed that therapists were really struggling prior to COVID, and just like many of you have seen and noticed our industry. And so I wanted to create a self-sustaining model that would help support both communities. And so our launch event was the day that shelter in place happened. And so we had to decide, okay, how do we want to show up for our therapist community? And within 3 weeks, we put on a series called Third Thursday for Therapists. And we had over 400 registrant therapists join. We had a welcome note from the senator, Senator Bell, and his whole premise was, therapists, we need you during COVID. You are going to help support us through this, but also not just thank you for doing that, but you also need to help support yourself during this time too. So we had 13 speakers, and the whole central focus is how do you transition from in-person services to telehealth? And so from that, we created the series, and every month we offer a topic to help support mental health professionals. And so that's a little bit about me and the work that we're doing. Central to the topic today about burnout and compassion fatigue is we work with a lot of mental health professionals that are really struggling right now with their caseloads, managing also their personal lives. And so we need to create more opportunities in our industry to support the clinicians who support our communities. Besides professionally, I also love dogs. This is my little Chiweenie Caesar, who's a rescue. And I also foster dogs. Last year we saved 12, but each of them have such a cool personality. So if you're a dog person, shout out. I love dogs. So, and as you know, they can also raise oxytocin, the love hormone, which is like stress reducing. So also a bonus. So today we'll do a quick meet and greet. And our goals for tonight are to briefly explore vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue. Many of you already know sort of the definitions. So then we'll saunter over to really focus more on compassion satisfaction, and we'll identify some ways to help support ourselves and our clients. And so then at the end, we'll just do a recap and a quick checkout. And so if you're open, oh, and first I just wanted to mention, this is a quick hour. So we're just sort of glossing over the top of this, and then I'll be giving you resources to continue having the conversation. And Triad is amazing. Many of you may know they have started this great community where you can continue having the conversation. And so the Triad support team has actually created Candy and Kelsey have created this chat room where you can go in and continue this conversation. And we'll be also adding additional resources that are talked about tonight in this group as well. So tonight is just kind of talking about the surveys, talking about a few things that we can do. And so we'll continue the conversation in a group. So first, I'd love for you to share with us your name, where you're viewing from. And here you'll notice I have your experience number. This chart is going to come up again later. And so if you feel comfortable to share your number in the chat, great. If not, just jot it down to yourself. But just taking a moment to check in with yourself and see how you're doing. So 1, I'm happy and confident. 2, I'm feeling okay. 3, I'm a bit stressed. 4, I might need some help. And 5, I'm very stressed or worried. And then lastly, what you're hoping to get out of today. So go ahead and just put a few items in the chat. I'm getting 3s. Hoping to find community. I love that. And community is so critical, important, and we're going to talk about ways to tap into that. Thank you for sharing that. Reduce stress, increase energy. Got a 2.5, some 3s. Oh, a 1, nice. And what's really nice is I love this number scale. You often see medical doctors use this scale. They'll say, what's your pain from 1 to 10? But using numbers is sometimes a nice way to figure out how you're feeling without assigning emotional vocabulary to it. So it's just an immediate thing. Of course, we always want to increase our emotional vocabulary, but especially for some people who haven't had the opportunity to learn emotions, assigning a number can be a quick way to get a gauge of how people are doing. Great. Okay, cool. Thank you everyone for sharing, and just kind of jot that down. And if you have paper and pen with you today, go ahead and we'll be taking some reflection notes, and you're welcome to also share in the chat anytime. So just a couple of reflection questions. How do you know when you're burned out? How do you know? What does it look like physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritual, or worldview, whatever that means to you? So irritable, cynicism, start to lack empathy, disorganized, dragging your feet to get to the next session. Yep. Exhausted. Yep. Edged, detached, fatigued, disengaged, not wanting to work, not going to work, avoiding tasks. Exactly. And I'm curious to hear from you, resenting clients. Yep. Imposter. And I'd love to hear from you too. Has that changed since the pandemic? And what's interesting is I've sort of heard both from some therapists. A lot of therapists have said that they've felt extremely burned out, more cases, more intense cases, not being able to keep up with referrals. And then I've also heard some therapists feel a lot of guilt because their schedule got better because they got to be remote and work from home and have sort of the comfort of their own surroundings around them. And so that brought on this other type of guilt as well. Yes, I stopped answering phones. I have heard that a lot from people, stopped answering referrals, stopped replying to email referrals, and having a lot of guilt about that too. Yep. Yes. Yep. Yep. And so I think that there's a power in being able to voice that this is happening and to share that with one another, because when you read the chat right now, you can see that a lot of your colleagues are going through the same things, and there's power in that validation. Yep. Yeah. So when we think about stress, Many of this is overview for people. A lot of the beginning slides here are, a lot of this is overview. We all know this. So we're coming together and sharing in this conversation. And I'm just your guide because I'm amongst colleagues. So a lot of this, So stress performance curve, Yerkes and Dodson really talks about stress and performance. So as you can see, the left arrow going up, the right arrow going to the right, and then there's this upside down parabola. And so this is really showing that as stress increases, our performance actually does better. And there's an optimum point of threshold where the sun is here. And that's when that stress and performance aligns perfectly. And then it gets to a point where your performance starts to decrease and you're not doing quite as well. And so Yerkes and Dodson studied this. And so they talk about this a lot in like sports psychology because, you need to have that level of stress to be able to get aroused and perform. And so in some ways, stress is a good thing. We often think of it as just like a bad thing, but it's part of the human experience. And so it's good. But when it starts to get chronic, and longstanding, like we've seen with the pandemic and all of us trying to show up and support our communities, then that can have some detrimental effects. We can feel overwhelmed, burned out. And so it's important to be really conscious of that. And so let's just talk about vicarious trauma, and then we'll talk about compassion fatigue. So vicarious trauma is an occupational challenge for people working and volunteering in the fields of victim services, law enforcement, emergency medical services, fire services, and other allied professions due to their continuous exposure to victims of trauma and violence. It looks like somehow somebody's able to scribble on the screen. I'm not sure how that's happening, everybody, but we'll roll with it. I always say that's show business. And then compassion fatigue here, a combination of physical, emotional, and spiritual depletion associated with caring for patients and significant emotional pain and distress. So we have here a little bit more. So compassion fatigue is stress resulting from exposure to a traumatized individual and has been described as the convergence of secondary traumatic stress and cumulative burnout, a state of physical and mental exhaustion by a depleted ability to cope with one's everyday environment. And so I really like this picture here because I think sometimes diagrams help to illuminate what we're talking about. So burnout is really about that sort of overwhelmed. It's often sort of those first stages of what you notice when you're stressed out. Secondary trauma is really that when we work with our patients and we hear these extreme cases and we're hearing these stories that are so impactful and horrific. There's so much death and that happened this year, and hearing these horrific stories and one after the next, and it just, that combined with the burnout can create compassion fatigue. And so I'm curious to hear from you all in the chat the different ways that you experience and how you know that you're experiencing vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. How do you know in all these different parts of your being? So think of ourselves as biological, psychological, social, and spiritual worldview. You've probably heard of biopsychosocial spiritual model. So when we think about ourselves in this frame, what are the different things that you experience when you have vicarious trauma?
I have a hard time separating myself from the client experience or patient experience during session.
Excellent. Yep. So, so as a therapist, being able to separate yourself from their story. Yep, definitely. And on the next slide, we'll be talking about too, exactly that. And I'll just skip there now and we can kind of toggle back and forth. Is
And
the
that's not necessarily a bad thing when you're dealing with clients in need. It's just when it gets to a degree, a quantity that knocks you out of center, out of balance.
um thanks, Bruce. I just circled down to find you there. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah.
Definitely. So these two slides here are about personal and professional. So there's a personal way that burnout impacts us. And so I see a lot of in the chat, physical exhaustion, tension stored in the body. Yes. Maybe you're feeling more sick. I see that in the chat. Holding my shoulder muscles and brain function decreases. Absolutely. And then what came up is issues regarding like the professional context. So performance and not being able to separate someone themselves from their clients. And there's other things that you might experience too. So like outside of the treatment room, always thinking about your patients. And so what Bruce was just highlighting is just really making sure that like we don't also over pathologize our cell, like our own cells too. And, you know, that sometimes it's okay when we feel and connect with our patients, but when it's all the time and we're really it's sort of at that next level. And so always thinking about patients, noticing that we're doing a lot of rescue fantasies about our patients, or the over identifying and the bystander guilt. We notice we're breaking therapeutic boundaries. When we start to notice all of these things, we're really entering this sort of this other territory, definitely. And so people are putting a lot of great stuff in the chat, putting off paperwork, doubting what I do in therapy. Yeah, so you're really losing that confidence in yourself and your abilities, definitely. Yep. And some of the risk factors with this too is always being in constant exposure of like very difficult cases, for example, having your own past trauma. If you're somebody who isolates and isn't able to express your feelings or your needs, and we often think about people who are new to this field as well, and sometimes not having a full breadth of training, or in their training sites having ineffective or non-supportive colleagues and teammates where you can process and debrief. And so that's why it's so incredible that organizations like Triad are having these opportunities for mental health professionals to come together and have these conversations, and to create a group where we can all support one another, because many of us have experienced these things. And so lots of other things coming up here too. Somebody says, how do you not over identify during an unprecedented event? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very difficult. Exactly. It's very difficult. Yep. Yep. And so we're going to go over some strategies in a moment. I'm also going to give you some assessments. But what are some other things that happen for therapists specifically as when they're dealing with vicarious trauma? What are a few other things that happen specifically for therapists in their experience that maybe prohibit them from being able to discuss their experience with other therapists? Doubting incompetence, absolutely. So maybe there's a fear, thanks Harvey. So maybe there's a fear to be able to even communicate with your fellow colleagues, almost like you have a scarlet letter and you can't share. I think about clinicians who lose a client who dies by suicide. And so that sort of that experience of not being able to disclose or have that conversation and the element of confidentiality, being fearful of breaking those bounds. And so I'm seeing in the chat here, realizing the work you've been ignoring, lack of compassion for everyone, including self, shame, perfectionistic expectations. Yes. Yeah. And with burnout and all of this too, and once you get to this, this place of vicarious trauma, sometimes your own existential issues can come up, and other interpersonal issues around grappling as about your profession in general. Do I even want to continue down the road of therapy? And really questioning your life's path. So thank you for all sharing about that today. So what can we do? So this is a meme, and here it is. It's this person who's saying everything's fine. They're just on their cell phone, avoiding all the swords all over their body here. And so the first step for us is bringing the unconscious conscious, right? And being aware of our stress levels, of are we burned out, or do we have compassion fatigue, and how do we do that? And so the first step is identifying your flags. And so being able to know what takes your wellness and joy from you. And so you think about the things that bring you joy. Feel free to drop those in the chat. And for some people, particularly I've noticed with graduate students, it can be really hard sometimes because you're so immersed in school that it's hard to remember the things that sort of would bring you joy because you're so busy, and then with a pandemic and life. And you may notice that they're not the same things that they once were. So for example, somebody who used to enjoy dancing in their 20s may not enjoy dancing in the same way in their 30s. And so maybe that's adjusting dancing to a different type. Or so thinking about what brings you joy, and then what takes wellness and joy from you. So what gets in the way of that? So perhaps schedules, feelings of procrastination could get in the way. I see in the chat, maybe pain. Being able to share and stigma gets in the way. Scheduling and energy level, that's a huge one. Yes. Being asked to do more and more with less and less resources. Yep. I also remember for those students in the group, I remember in grad school sometimes feeling like I couldn't go to the movies and have fun because I had so much on my plate to do. And then my friends would go to the movies, and the next day, did I do my work? No, because I was procrastinating. So if that's relatable to any students in here. Good. Yep. And then how do you know, oops, grammatical error. How do you know you're stressed? So do you feel it in your body? Do you feel it in your mind? Yep. So saying you can't sleep, when you start overloading yourself to avoid. So the first steps is kind of figuring out and bring yourself to conscious. So for me personally, I was teaching at multiple universities and master's and doctoral programs, and I was also consulting full time. And so I was certainly burning the stick with that saying, the candle at both ends. And I noticed that I was getting lots of parking tickets. And so for me, that was a sign, when I wasn't aware of how stressed I was, that I wasn't being present. And so thinking about, how do you know when you're stressed? So for some people, it's going to be a parking ticket. For other people, it may be, your heart's racing, or you're getting headaches, or you're feeling tired often. Definitely. So now let's think about ourselves as holistic beings. So we can look at our life in so many different spheres. And here you'll notice lots of different categories. So work, health, your ability to focus on your personal growth, your financial goals, yourself as a being and community, your friendships, your recreation life, your home, your family, emotionally. Here again, spiritual or worldview. And so, what you can do as an activity to check in with yourself is you could do that rating scale 1 to 5, and you can determine how am I doing on the scale in each of these spheres. And so, if you notice you're not a 5 in all these spheres, then that may be telling you I need to create a plan to help bolster this one sphere so that I can feel more balanced. And balance can help create more um, of a overall holistic way to sort of move forward more confidently. And so being able to check in these different ways. And so the next thing that I want to go to is this numbers chart that we talked about a moment ago. So many of you in the chat indicated feeling like a 3. So the idea is that when you get to a 3, we're able to implement some sort of mechanism or coping strategy prior to getting to that 4 or 5. And so some of these coping strategies, and we're going to go over some options in a moment, and this is something that's great to do with clients because it's so visual, is to be able to access things like mindfulness, guided imagery, diaphragmatic breathing. And these are things that you can actually practice at a 1 or 2 because it's sort of like that whole muscle memory. If you do it at a 1 or 2, you're much more likely to do it when you're at a 3. And the idea is hopefully if you do it at a 3, it'll help mitigate getting to a 4. And once you start to get to a 4 and 5, it's as you all know, being able to get help through therapy, consultation, additional other types of supports. And it's one of those things where I know but it's one of those things where it's about doing it. And I think as therapists, we often put ourselves we don't always engage in the activities we say we should do. And so when you think about a lot of the treatments that you prescribe or interventions, there are things that a lot of the times we should be practicing also for ourselves. So, okay. So thinking about compassion satisfaction. So compassion satisfaction is about the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work. So think about right now how much pleasure your current work gives you. If you'd like to put in the chat, feel free. Some 4s. 4, 5. Oh, very satisfied. I'm getting a lot of satisfied. I see a 1, a 3. Oh, a 10 off the charts. A 4 after a job change. Yep. Great. 2. So compassion satisfaction. So this is a diagram here, and the idea is it's about adding some sort of interventions and identifying your satisfaction in order to mitigate against compassion fatigue. So this is the chart from earlier that you saw. So burnout plus secondary trauma, and then that equals compassion satisfaction. Burnout and secondary trauma equals compassion fatigue. And so the idea is if you can put compassion satisfaction before, then you won't have compassion fatigue. So this is an assessment that I'm going to give you guys. It's free It's accessible online. It's in, I believe, 12 languages. And it's called The Professional Quality of Life. Many of you may have heard of it. And so I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to put it in the chat for you all. Let me see here. Can y'all see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm going to put this in the chat. And there's a lot of research on this. You can check out this website, The Professional Quality of Life. And they also have this card. It's a pocket card that people can put in their pocket for when they need it. And so it's about caring for yourself in the face of difficult work. Our work can be overwhelming. Our challenge is to mitigate or to maintain our resilience so that we can keep doing the work with care, energy, and compassion. And so 10 things to do each day: get enough sleep, get enough to eat, vary the work that we do, doing light exercise, do something pleasurable, focus on what you did well, learn from your mistakes, share a private joke, pray, meditate, or relax, and support a colleague. And then also the section here, focus your empathy. Your empathy for others helps you do your job. It is important to take good care of your feelings and thoughts by monitoring how you use them. The most resilient workers are those that know how to turn their feelings to work mode when they go on duty, but off work mode when they go off duty. This is not denial. It is a coping strategy. It is a way they get maximum protection while working. Feeling switched to work mode, and maximum support while resting, which is feeling switched off work mode. And so I'd love to hear in the chat how you all go about switching from work mode to at home mode. And that can be particularly difficult when you work from home. So I'd love to hear some tips in the chat that you can share with one another. And so here are a few more just on this card while people are dropping some ideas in the chat. Make this a conscious process. Talk to yourself as you switch. Use images that make you feel safe and protected or connected and cared for to help you switch. Develop rituals that help you switch as you start and stop work. And breathe slowly and deeply to calm yourself when starting a tough job. So one thing that I personally do to help try to create that boundary is I have a plaque that I tap when I enter my workspace and when I leave my workspace. And it's like a mental moment that I have with myself that now I'm engaging back into the world again. And it helps me. And I'm seeing lots of things here in the chat. I also see a question to me about journaling. And yeah, journaling is a great strategy for boosting gratitude. So gratitude journals. Harvey, togetherwell.org, my nonprofit, we have lots of articles actually where we've discussed this. And so in that triad group, I'll share a resource about that. We do something called Wellness Wednesday, where we do lots of topics on various wellness topics for the community for free. And so we do recap articles, and that was actually one topic that we talked about. So I'll provide that resource in that triad group later. So I love meditating for 5 minutes. Oh, I love that. That's a great way to separate time from work and personal space. Candy. Bruce says, do a challenging word puzzle when I get home to clear my mind and ease the transition from work to home. That's really clever, Bruce. I love that because that really forces your mind to switch on and off. I actually, at one point, and this was before COVID, because as we mentioned earlier, the mental health industry was already very, inundated even prior to COVID. And at one point, I was feeling burned out, and I started doing trapeze, because the experience of trapeze and the fear of walking up the ladder was incompatible with the sort of ruminating that I was doing, and it actually helped kind of switch me out of it. And so let's see, Allie says I sing. Nice. Great. Oh yeah, Harvey says trapeze. Listen to a romance novel on the way home. Love that. Great. So that's really helpful. Thanks for sharing some tips with your colleagues. Great. All right. So now let's talk about creating a wellness list. So if you have that piece of paper next to you, try to think about ourselves and these as these holistic beings, and there's so many different parts to us, and there's different ways that we can design our self-care strategies. So think of ourselves in a physical being, an emotional, social, spiritual, or worldview. And so, you've all heard that saying, well, just take a bubble bath for self-care. Well, that's not really self-care. Self-care is so much more strategic than that. And so if you're feeling physical stress, then maybe there's another way that we need to be coping with that. And so, of course, always being mindful of our general practitioners and their guidance and advice and checking with them. But diaphragmatic breathing can be an excellent coping strategy. To do diaphragmatic breathing correctly, you want to make sure that, in fact, why don't we all do that together? Let's just take a moment together, optional. Feel free to opt out if you don't want to. If you put your right hand on your chest and your left hand on your stomach, I'd like you to take 3 breaths in and out together. So breathing in and out, and in and out, and in and out. And on this next one, I'd like you to notice whether your right or left hand goes further up than the other. So an in and out, and in and out. So in the chat, let me know in your belly breathing here, which hand goes further out, your right or your left hand? Seeing some rights or seeing some lefts. Great. So if you're doing diaphragmatic breathing, then your left hand, if that was what was on your stomach, should be going out farther, because that means you're breathing from your stomach as opposed to your chest. If you're breathing from your chest, it can actually exacerbate more of those stress symptoms, right? Because it's more of that shallow breathing. So making sure that when we do these exercises that we're mindful of it. So running, dancing, eating well, napping, but of course not too much or too little, walking, yoga, drinking water, emotionally identifying our feelings, journaling, practicing forgiveness, affirmations, therapy, asking for help, expressing yourself, accepting compliments. And then social, moderation of social media. That's something nowadays we think about. Setting boundaries, calling a friend, Zoomaroke instead of karaoke if we're, sheltering in place times, or virtual dates, Zoom parties, FaceTime, pet time. We started off tonight talking about dogs and their wonderful, friendly abilities and how amazing they are. Lots of research on that. And then like worldview coping. So prayer, meditation, being in nature, connecting with community, Zoom services, journaling, yoga, Tai Chi, silence. So take a moment and kind of reconnect with ways that help support your own wellness. And we often do this with clients, but we forget to do it for ourselves. So this is just a moment to take for ourselves to think about this. And so for me personally, I noticed that I needed to double up more self-care during the pandemic. Just doing one thing wasn't cutting it for me anymore. I had to get more creative, come up with more self-care, or I had to double up. Things that I once enjoyed, I didn't quite enjoy quite as much anymore. So it's something we have to revisit sometimes. So the next thing I just want to highlight is flow. So many of you have probably heard of flow. There's a lot of research on this, but it's different than pleasure. Pleasure is something you enjoy doing. It's great. Flow is when you get so immersed that you are just in your element, you're in your zone. You aren't getting distracted. And it's very difficult to do with all of our modern technologies. I'm holding my phone here. With all of our modern technology. So think about the activity that brings you flow and share that in the chat if you know what that is, if you have experienced your flow. So for me personally, a big part of, I know this is wild, but I love to organize and I can just get in the zone organizing. And also I really love crafts and doing crafting. I can get lost in lost painting. And so I'm seeing, oh, so many amazing. Bruce is juggling. Yeah, how long can you juggle, Bruce? So I'm seeing researching mental health topics.
I started when I was 15 years old, and I kept doing it until I was 65, and then my peripheral vision kind of wouldn't support it anymore. But you know, it's a great hobby and a great stress reliever.
I can juggle for about 1 minute, but nothing longer. That's about it.
I can juggle for 3 hours.
Oh my gosh, we want a video in the triad group, Bruce.
Well, you'd have to get in a time machine first.
I'm seeing so many great flow. Baking, oh, good one, Alicia. Running, swimming, meditation, crocheting. Wow, great. Oh, I got another organizing. Thanks, Randy. Great. Working in my garden. Definitely. Great. So, and then thinking about things that get in the way of your flow for your iPhones, you know, things that happen. And then the next thing is, what is something you can do to reignite your flow? So for many of us, because of the pandemic, we've been burned out, we've been overwhelmed. Some of us have compassion fatigue, vicarious traumatization, right? So what can we do if we've been feeling stuck? There's something that can help us reignite our flow. And so for some of it's redesigning a strategy to create time. Earlier, somebody said it's about scheduling and time. It's hard to do. So how can we create that space and eliminate those obstacles? So for us to be able to look into that and really check in with ourselves, how to create more flow. And I love to see how all of you have such great topics in here. And Jessica, I love that. Be accountable to someone else. Yep. Great. And I was mentioning earlier, togetherwell.org, we have a bunch of articles and some of them highlight these topics and give tips. Karen, you're right on target here. Can I get rid of the boss? I hear you. So now we're going to go into systems and organizations. So that was a good cue up. So now we're going to talk about, so burnout in organizations is very real. So red flags. So whenever I'm in an organization and I hear someone say, we're like family, to me, my immediate flags go up, my spidey senses, and I'm hearing, you don't want me to have boundaries. That's what I hear. And so say in the chat if you've heard someone say this before, because the truth is, this is your work. This is not your family. And there's this element that kind of makes you feel bad, like, oh, I should be taking on more to help the family. I should be doing more. Exactly. And I see Randy says, that is my current organization and it is a dysfunctional family. Yes. Tanya says, I have heard this. Muriel says, heard it several times. Yes. So it's not something that is helpful the way that they say it, and it's insidious because it takes you a minute to be like, are you, what's that about? So and I'm saying, haha, yes, Michelle, you're right, this is my current situation, such a dysfunctional family. Yes, all the time. My work got mad that I wasn't working every weekend, not current work, thank goodness. Oh my goodness. Yeah, Colette. Oh, here's another one. She tells us all how strong we are when we are starting to burn out. So that gets me to, you're resilient. So we talk so much in the mental health field about resiliency, and there is so much wonderfulness about that topic. And one of the, it's just so important, but there's a dark side to resiliency, right? And it's when people use that to get us to do more. And when we think to ourselves, I need to be resilient, but really what we're telling ourselves, I need to ignore my boundaries and do more. And so that can be really insidious, and especially in our field, because many of us have bleeding hearts and want to help the communities, and that's why we join in. And so just this example here I made up, well, Kaya this is like if a boss were to say this, well, Kaya is able to answer emails after 5 p.m. EST, why can't you? Or them like positioning other people in front of you like they're doing better than you because they're actually breaking their boundaries. And so what we can do is when we're supervising or working with colleagues, we can reward people. We can try to change this dynamic by rewarding people for taking their self-care opportunities, setting appropriate boundaries, offering authentic feedback and praising people for that, and checking our own biases. So I have heard friends say, well, this is how I did it in grad school. And I've heard some colleagues of mine kind of say things about feeling like some students are entitled when really they're just advocating for their own self-agency. And so we always have to kind of check ourselves and our own biases around the idea of this topic and what self-care means. Self-care is not selfish. And so we all grew up in the same society here in the United States. And well, for those of you who did grow up in the United States, and is this sort of mentality around, what more can you do? Because we're this industrious society, consistently trying to do more and do more and do more. And we have to break that. Yes. And then checking in with employees on their goals, what brings them joy at work? And then allowing for safe feedback. And I say safe feedback because sometimes it's not safe for employees to share how they feel because there is a hierarchy. And so being able to have anonymous feedback, and sometimes that's also not safe, right? Too, because you have 3 employees, so it's one of them. And so being able to just acknowledge too, if you're really going to be able to get authentic feedback. And letting your staff and your team and your colleagues know about wellness opportunities. I worked for an organization for a while and nobody had told me about the EAP program, not the HR person. I had to dig and find it. And so I could have been getting free therapy for a while and I had no idea. So check out your employee assistance programs. Margaret saying, no, it's not safe to share at all. Exactly. So knowing when it's safe and when it's not safe. And we can do a better job in organizations to be aware of that. Yep. Exactly. So here are just some resources, but don't worry, we're going to be putting this in that triad group, and there'll also be a recap email that's going to go out for all of you who attended today. But support resources are connect with your network, check in with associations, get mentors. I'm personally a first generation college student. I never would have gone to grad school without mentors or even college. And so it's really important to have mentors even when you graduate as well. Also being able to access your own therapy, professional consultation groups, And all these websites will be posted, but togetherwell.org has articles. Third Thursday for Therapists, we actually did a talk on this exact topic, compassion fatigue, with speakers and expert speakers in the community, and some other links that we'll post. So just to recap for tonight, that was a quick hour together. We checked in, we had a couple of reflection questions thinking about our relationship with burnout. And then we recapped, and then we talked about the following goals. So we explored briefly vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue. And then we discussed a little bit about compassion satisfaction, and we went over different types of diagrams to help support, like what kinds of coping strategies can you do? What types of assessments exist? Just a couple highlighted. And what are other types of ways we can check in with ourselves? It's so important. There's this analogy, and some of you may have heard this, and I'm a pescatarian, so I hate to share these animal cruelty stories, but you've probably heard of the frog and the pot of water. And so if you put a frog in a pot of water on a stove, and you just put the water on slightly warm, and then it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, the frog will sit in the pot until it's boiling and pass on. And it doesn't jump out of the pot because it happens so subtly over time. And so it's so critical for us to be able to check in with ourselves, do these, check in 1 through 5. Hey, how am I doing? For many of you, tonight was the first time or moment all day that you had a moment to check in. Hey, how am I doing? And so being able to check in with ourselves and notice when we're starting to get burned out, and being a support to our colleagues. Hey, I noticed that you're getting into some arguments, or I noticed, hey, you've been trolling a lot of people online, in a nice supportive way. But there's different ways that we can help support one another. And when we do it non-judgmentally, because I've definitely been burned out. I've snapped at someone before. I was telling you about my speeding tickets and my parking tickets. And so when we can really connect as a collegial team and bring our guards down, then we'll be so much more able to be able to share with one another, like you all did tonight. I love how much you guys shared in the chat, and being able to share your experiences with burnout and compassion fatigue. It's so important to validate. One of the number one ways that we can support ourselves is by being in community and by validating that we're going through this together. And there's such a curative property in that. And so being able to co-regulate with other people is so important, to have that one person where you could be like, yeah, I see you, I get you. So with that, just to kind of check out for the evening, let us know how you're feeling now. You checked in earlier in the night, you shared how you were doing. Think of how you're doing now. Think if, has your number changed? Is it the same? Maybe it's a little more because you're like, oh, I have this assessment I need to do for myself. See how you're feeling, and keep posting in the chat, please. I'm gonna, a 2 edging to a 1, nice. And I'm gonna go on to the next slide, but please keep going in the chat. And just if you're wanting to connect, I love to connect, and you're welcome to join us at Togetherwell as a professional on our platform. We're kind of like Psychology Today, but with workshops, and as a nonprofit. So we connect mental health professionals to the community to provide emotional wellness workshops, and it's free to join. You just have to go through a background check. You have to pay for that, but Togetherwell doesn't take it, just the verification company that makes sure everyone's qualified on our platform, which is a nominal fee. And then connect with us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Twitter, did I say that one? I get them all mixed up. And we started a TikTok, but nothing's there yet. And come to our free therapist events that we have every third Thursday. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me anytime. And thank you so much. And I'm going to stop the slides just in case anyone wanted to say anything? Oh, my pleasure, everybody. Thank you for being here with me. It was my absolute pleasure. I am so passionate about supporting therapists. Like I said, Together was 100% volunteer, including myself. And it's because I believe in the work that we do as a collective. And I appreciate you for being here on this journey and sharing with all of us your experience, because we're all in this together. I appreciate you. But if anyone has any last questions or thoughts, I'd be happy to continue. But otherwise, we'll be on Triad in the chat. We'll keep the conversation flowing. Oh, thank you so much, everybody, for all your gracious comments in the chat. I appreciate that.
Thank you all for attending today's session. A huge thank you to Michele for being our guest today. Just as a reminder for everybody, an email will be shared out to the group next week with us, the session's recording, as well as resources that were shared today. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next month's Let's Talk, as well as the Triad group. Hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.